Hello, and welcome to another edition of Data Dialogues, part of the Data Vault Innovators community. My name is Richard Harris. I'm the Account Director for Ignition. And joining me today is our Practice Manager, Steve Rose. G'day, Steve. How are you doing?
Good, thanks, Richard. And how about yourself?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Well, look, today's topic is conducting a data maturity assessment. Lots of organizations periodically undergo through a review of where their strategic priorities should be. And in response to that, we've created a service that we provide into the marketplace. So we thought it'd be a good idea today to just check in with yourself to understand a little bit more about what the review is. As I often explain to people, in this day and age, we know the expression "there's more than one way to skin a cat," but quite often, a lot of the challenges that organisations face is, well, which cat should they skin first? There are so many priorities, and of course, that's how I position where the data maturity assessment comes in. So I might start off by Steve by asking you probably the most obvious question, like what is really the objective of a data maturity assessment?
Thank you, Richard. So, the data maturity assessment is aimed to provide organisations with a baseline understanding of the maturity of their data management and governance practices. Um, the aim of good data management and data governance practices is to ensure that you're leveraging the best value of your data that you have. On that journey, you need to know where's your starting point. So ultimately, that's the aim of the data maturity assessment, to give you that starting point.
Excellent. So when we talk about what we're trying to achieve, you're saying positioning this as a look at how well an organization is basically utilizing another one of its assets, in this case, data, maximizing it for insight for opportunities or indeed lowering operational costs. That seems like a fairly logical starting point, and obviously, yeah, understanding where they want to go. So who would benefit most from doing a maturity review?
Um, that's also a good question. And I think that there's not really, any organisation would benefit from having a data maturity assessment. If we think about the opposite ends of a maturity scale, so you have an organisation that might be at the lower end of the maturity scale, then they get the benefit of expert, experienced advice on, how to further mature their data management practices and how to leverage and unlock the potential of their data. If they're at the other end of the scale where they're quite mature and they've had data management and data governance practices in place for quite some time, then the data maturity assessment provides independent expert validation, if you like, of the practices that they've put in place, giving senior executives comfort that the money that's been invested in that has been well spent.
Yeah, I remember back in my career, I had a very enlightening conversation with a CMO who pointed out that she and her team was so embedded or down in the foxhole, as she put it, on a daily basis. They never really had a chance to look above the parapet and see what was happening in the future, what was best practice. And she relied very heavily on third parties who, focus on a very specific niche area of capability and then relied upon them to keep her up to date on what happens. And it sounds like this is exactly the same thing. Organizations can't realistically be expected to understand what is best practice all the time and knowing everything that is out there. So, organizations that specialize in this case, the management of data can provide a lot of experience, built up from, the many projects that we do. That sounds pretty reasonable. In terms of what kind of people, in terms of roles and titles inside of organizations, have you seen that are the drivers or the people who are most interested in conducting the reviews?
I'd have to say that uh, data data is one of those things in an organisation where the vast majority of the attention it gets is at a micro level, not at a macro level. And the impact of that is that it's an organic evolution if you think about data and how it's used and leveraged by the organisation. And it's not until I find that it's not until that it doesn't strategically support the organisation's objectives is typically when you first hear about it. When data is being observed more as a cost rather than a benefit. And the people that make those sorts of the types of people that make those observations tend to be more the senior execs and the people that are accountable for supporting the development of organisational strategy. Very rarely do you hear about it at the coalface because generally that is very transactional, not very strategic, and quite often those sorts of issues can be resolved by having person A talking to person B. But we don't think about data at a macro level in terms of my data landscape. Does it support not only operationally, but does it support us strategically? And so that's typically the sorts of people that we would hear it from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know we recorded one of these data dialogues on the subject of the highest paid person's opinion. And it sounds like that resonates here as well. You've got this disparity between the people who are the executive leadership team who might look at the balance sheet and say, well, how much are we spending on managing data without fully appreciating A, the complexities, but B, probably the benefits that they could get from effective data management, as you say, particularly if they start treating it as an asset to be nurtured and managed in that way. So when you are approaching a review, you mentioned there were some likenesses in the past to physical data assets. What is covered in the review? What are we looking for when trying to understand a company's current levels of data maturity and ideally where they should be?
That's a good question. I guess the first thing that I would look for is sentiment of the business, because that's usually the first sort of thing that you hear that leads you to think, there's some issues here. And that sentiment we usually capture through a survey of some key stakeholders within the business. And typically it comes back with, that data doesn't have the trust of the business, or various other bits and pieces, or reports take too long to produce. You often find that the symptoms of a problem actually tell you a lot about what the problem actually is. Another thing that we look for as well is, does the organisation already have data governance in place? Do they have a data governance committee or forum or something like that that has overall accountability for data within the organisation? Another good thing to look for as well is enterprise architecture. There's data and how it moves about has a straight direct correlation, with the architecture, the system architecture, and infrastructure of the business. All the other areas, predominantly, such as the operational aspects, the DevOps, tooling, and all that sort of stuff. That's the stuff that sort of tends to fall out in the discussions that you have and interviews that you have with people. You sort of tease out these finer details, but at a very high level, I would say sentiment of the business, definitely number one. I would say, do they have a data governance forum, which sort of tells you that they have some understanding of what data management should be. And then the other one I would say is enterprise architecture. Those are the three areas I would say.
What about the skills and capabilities of the team, that are managing, and even like downstream the business users? Are we looking at their, understanding of data and how to use it?
That's a really good question, and I think when we think about a physical asset that can suffer, degrade over time through wind, rain, or mechanical use or whatever, we we can think about that same degradation occurring in data, but through people and processes.
Right.
So the more people you have, the more processes you have, the more likely, or the more opportunity rather, there is for data to degrade. And culture is certainly one of those areas where it is very uh, can be very challenging because quite often data management is seen as not adding direct business value to a person when they're undertaking a business process or even a department necessarily. And so it's often seen as invasive and an unnecessary overhead. Like it doesn't help me, even though it helps the organisation, and I buy into the broader benefits of good data management, but it doesn't help me in my day to day. So we find that can often uh, shape what a person's capability is or a person's expectations are. And we do uncover this. We
Yeah.
do have a section in our data maturity review that does look at sort of general culture. It also looks at individuals in their roles and what they do and so on and so forth. But it also looks at, well, if I'm learning this at a detailed level, how does that actually contribute towards the strategic goals of the organisation over here? So it's not just does person A know what he needs to do, know how he needs to do it, and is he doing that in a way that is consistent with good data management practice? But is what he's doing actually relevant for what we're doing, what we need to do strategically over here? Because sometimes that translation can be lost as well. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Which it does, and it's interesting because you talked about governance and do they have a governance structure? And I know that from my observations, over the recent years, governance has almost been considered a dirty word, and I think people were putting it in the too hard basket. And then, of course, a lot of regulations came in, the GDPR, and of course, we have an update to our own Privacy Act, which is going to drive a lot more needs to look at data governance. But I think what I'm seeing in the conversation come through more now is we need effective data governance so we can educate the business users over what data is actually available, how it can be used, and putting it into their hands to help them be more efficient, in their decision making. So it's kind of interesting that that those two I think definitely go hand in hand, showing each individual just how data can benefit them, right?
Yeah, I would, yes, agreed. I would say that data governance is an organisational wide capability. It's
Yeah,
often perceived, as an IT capability, but it is in fact a whole of organisation. If you fulfil a role using some sort of a computer or you input data or whatever, then you are an actor in the life cycle of a piece of data, right? That makes you part of the problem, but equally it also makes you part of the solution. So data governance needs to be considered as a should be considered as an organisational wide capability,
yeah,
not just an IT one.
for sure, for sure. So, if people are, really looking at their organisation and asking this question, when would you say is the right time to conduct, a review?
Um, I mean, I would say there's no. I mean, any time's the right time to do the review. There's never a wrong time to understand or get an understanding of where you are from a data maturity perspective. But I would say where it's of particular value, I think, would be where an organisation has just refreshed its business strategy. That would be a really good time to do it to make sure that your data landscape is aligned and going to be an enabler for those strategic outcomes. When an organisation undergoes significant restructure is another one, because that changes processes, that changes people, both of which operate on data. Um, and that can also include, acquisitions and things like that as well, where
Yeah,
you've got other organisations that you're bringing in and you're sort of merging processes and things like that. So I would say wherever there's significant structural or process change, or whenever there's a refresh of business strategy, I personally, and I'm going to talk personally, I would always be looking to do an assessment of the alignment of my data maturity and business strategy.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's where a lot of the times we see challenges and problems come in is when a great idea is had about, okay, a new direction, we're going to build a new business unit or a new capability, or we're going to adapt to market pressures in this way. And all of a sudden, we realize all the data that we need access to is just not there, or it's not trusted, or we don't have the right skills or technology in the business. And of course, that can have a big impact on the success of that strategy. And what you might end up with is a strategy that was perfectly correct, perfectly appropriate for the time, but just wasn't able to be executed because we do live in such a heavy data reliance society now that we definitely need to be there. So look, so someone's obviously thinking about doing a review. What are they going to get in their hands at the end of a review? What's the output that we tend to want to give people?
Well, we do provide a report that does provide a summary level for the execs, but also goes into a lot of detail. It's got the results of the survey, some key findings, some key themes, and then a set of recommendations that are rated, a roadmap, a remediation roadmap to support with operational planning, and some key dependencies. It's we found that you're going to put a roadmap in front of a client. Does the client in fact have those dependencies in place to be able to enact that roadmap? We also provide that detail as well, and any key risks that we see. And as you mentioned earlier on, culture is definitely
Yeah.
overcoming that misconception that good data management is an overhead uh, and invasive. When actually the truth of it is that if we think about data governance and stewardship functions are already happening in the organisation today. If person A is sending person B data and there's something wrong with it, person B will talk to person A to get it resolved. Just because it's not formalised doesn't mean that these activities are happening, because in our experience, the organisation couldn't function without data stewardship activities actually happening. It's just because they're not formalised. So we shouldn't really be looking at it as though it's an extra thing that people need to do, because it's typically part of what people are doing already. So yeah, anyway, that's and we provide a presentation as well, and we get feedback and all that sort of stuff. So it's pretty good,
This
pretty
would be
good.
a tool that someone could really absorb in and then start mapping out. Again, going back to that business strategy, if there needs to be changes in culture or training or investment in technology, they now
Correct.
have a roadmap for understanding what's needed and why, whether it be a risk reduction or an opportunity they could
Yeah,
exploit.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, fair
Yeah,
enough.
exactly.
So, look, probably the most common question I get is, well, what do you see when you've done these reviews? Are there common challenges or common themes that you have seen from conducting these reviews that might be useful to our audience?
Um, yeah, I'd probably say the most common ones are that we see are bridging between silos. We tend to find as being, if you go, especially if you go to large organisations, you can find that the operating model kind of supports quite a siloed environment, and not necessarily that's a bad business model, but it's bad for data management and data governance. And it can often be challenging, particularly when a piece of data will flow between silos to work out, well, who's the owner of that data, who's accountable for that data. So sometimes, I guess, unraveling those things can be quite a big challenge. And I've already talked already about some of the cultural aspects that we can face, can also be a bit challenging. But I guess I spoke to a client recently, and I said to the client, I said, look, the data governance issues that you have are a well trodden path in terms of how to remediate them, from a technology and from a process perspective. The biggest hurdle that we tend to overcome when we're trying to roll out a data governance program is the culture, the people, that is being able to change those mindsets. So change management is a significant aspect of any data governance program that you put in place.
Yeah, I can see that. Look, a large part of over my career has been looking at that challenge of the skills gap that we see time and time again. We're having a much greater focus than ever on use of data, people who understand how to manage it, and businesses are business have a high demand for those skills. Traditionally, what they've tried to do is go out to the market and hire them, and what that's done, of course, is dramatically inflate the cost of those resources. Now we're at a point where some of the new requirements, we're in a world now of generative AI, which no one has native skills in because it's just so new. That the only way we're going to develop these skills is by investing in our existing resources, our staff, giving them the time and the space to learn new technologies, to understand not just the processes, but why those processes are important. This re-education and training and investment in existing staff is really now the cheapest and fastest way of getting where you need to be in terms of adopting that data as an asset mentality, right?
Yeah.
Well, look,
completely agree.
Steve, thank you very much for your time today. I know, look, I've seen quite a few of the reports that have gone out, and I've seen, just how useful they can be to people who are trying to, let's say, bring the hearts and minds of people along inside the organisation as to why treating data and asset is important. I'm sure others will be of interest. Will be interested too. If you are thinking about looking at getting an assessment of your current level of data maturity, as Steve said, if it's part of a change in strategy or dealing with new operational structures, etc., then our data maturity review is available as a fixed cost consultancy. It's a relatively painless, quick service, and something that I'm sure could be of value. So, Steve, once again, thank you for joining me today, and to all those listening today, thank you for your time, and we'll see you on the next Data Dialogues podcast.
Thank you, Richard.